All right, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is our last event of the year. We have done we've done over 100 virtual events, and if you have watched as many as my friend Silver, you get like a big gold star. So I'm so happy and proud to be doing this last event of the year. Glad you are here to join us. This is Left Bank Books and Missouri Botanical Garden welcome head of the American Indian Studies program at California State University, East Bay, Enrique Salmón, who will discuss his new book, Iwígara, American Indian Ethnobotanical Traditions and Science. Enrique will be in conversation with Robbie Hart from the Missouri Botanical Garden. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We are celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of the Missouri Botanical Garden, the supporters of Enrique Salmón, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books with curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are very happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. It is a beautiful book. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. So thank you for your support. We need your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. They've worked so hard this year. I want to thank them very much publicly and privately, personally. We will be taking questions from the audience, you at the end of the event. So please type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point throughout the event. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. About tonight's book. Tap into thousands of years of plant knowledge. The belief that all life forms are interconnected and share the same breath, known in the Raramuri tribe, as Iwígara, has resulted in a treasury of knowledge about the natural world passed down for millennia by native cultures. Ethnobotanist Enrique Salmón builds on this concept of connection and highlights 80 plants revered by North America's indigenous peoples. Salmón teaches us the ways plants are used as food and medicine, the details of their identification and harvest, their important health benefits, plus their role in traditional stories and myths. Discover in these pages how the timeless wisdom of Iwígara can enhance your own kinship with the natural world. Publishers Weekly says, a beautifully illustrated and philosophically uplifting guide to indigenous North American plant use. This lovely compendium will strike a chord with many a nature-loving reader. And Hudson Valley 360 says, I appreciate all the practical information and lore contained in these descriptions, which will cause me to look at familiar plants such as the stinging nettle and the staghorn sumac in new ways. Enrique Salmón, PhD, is the head of the American Indian Studies program at California State University, East Bay in Hayward, California. His own Raramuri family has always gathered, grown, and used plants for many medicinal and cultural purposes. And Robbie Hart is, tonight, Enrique will be in conversation with Robbie Hart from the Missouri Botanical Garden. He is a scientist for the William L. Brown Center. And now, without further ado, I am very pleased and proud to welcome Enrique Salmón and Robbie Hart for Left Bank Books. If everyone at home would please help me in giving them a very wonderful round of applause. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
We have a wonderful crowd here tonight. I am super excited that you are here with me.
It's good to be here. Looking forward to this conversation with Robbie.
Great. I'm really excited to have you here, Enrique, and thanks so much, Shane, for hosting us. Enrique, I'm an ethnobotanist as well, but I think it's probably a really new word to many of those in the audience. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what ethnobotany is to you. It appears in the title of the book, and how you came to the field of ethnobotany yourself.
Well, the standard definition is taken from Richard I. Ford, one of my mentors, the study of the direct interrelationships between plants and people. And the key word there is direct, where we all have relationships with plants, because of the food we eat and so on, but not everyone has this direct relationship, meaning they understand the full life cycle of plants and how to collect the plants, when to collect them, and how to administer them for medicine in one example, or how to process them for food. And I came to ethnobotany kind of accidentally. I was, going through my education. Every opportunity I got to write a research paper, for example, in one of my classes, I always found a way to, if I could, to write about my people or American Indians. And then I grew up with a lot of knowledge about plants because of my family and so on. So when I could, I would write about plant knowledge as well. And when I was finishing my master's degree at Colorado College, and I was asking my advisor, well, where should I apply? Because, for a PhD. And she looked at me and said, well, you're an ethnobotanist. You should apply to universities that have ethnobiology programs. And that's the first time I really understood what I was doing. And that led to going to Arizona State and doing a field school with Richard I. Ford. And then, it's brought me to where I am today.
And was your fieldwork for your original studies back with the Raramuri community as well?
Yeah, I've always written and researched about my people, but I've written and researched about a lot of other native communities around mostly the Southwest and Northwest Mexico. But I've worked and written about some of my experiences from Ethiopia, Australia, up in the Arctic Circle area, and so on. Because there's plants everywhere around the world.
So what led you then from this sort of specific aerial focus to this book, which takes a more general view across Native American communities?
Well, again, this is one of those things that I wasn't really planning. I had written another book called Eating the Landscape, and that was more about American Indian small-scale horticulturalists and farmers and so on. And the folks at Timber Press up in Portland, Oregon, they wanted someone to write a book about ethnobotany from an Indigenous perspective. And they reached out to me, asked me if I'd be willing to do something like this. And originally they wanted, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 different plant entries. But as I started thinking about it, I was realizing I really want to do something deeper. I want to introduce these specific plants as individuals. From an Indigenous perspective, from my culture's perspective, these plants are relatives. They are directly related to us. We share spirit, we share breath with them. And so I wanted to tell their stories. So I re-proposed back to Timber Press, why don't I do a book about a smaller set of plants? And they agreed. And so I immediately contacted what I call my ethnobotany network around the country, and asked them to send me back a list of 10 plants that they think are the most culturally important, to their region. And I started getting the list back, and from those lists, I put together this list of 80 plants that ended up in this book, Iwígara. And then that's why I can spend more time focusing on, the specific story about Ligusticum porteri, Chuchupate, what it means to my culture and other cultures and so on, and all those relationships built up from just that one plant.
Well, and that's something that really stood out to me about this book. As a botanist and an ethnobotanist especially, we're really used to seeing, long lists of plant names, basically, that long lists of plants that are used. And this really came off so differently. It's such an intimate and utilitarian view of these plants and these profiles, and also a very botanical view. I mean, you can see the training of a botanist in it as well. So I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned taking a inspiration from your network of other ethnobotanists. As you looked at plants that were either new to you or maybe plants that were familiar to you from your own previous life or research, but were also used by other communities, did anything really surprise you? Maybe a plant that you had known well in one context, but was used in a totally different way somewhere else?
Well, the one that comes to mind immediately is blueberries. Probably like most people, we think of blueberries as those, as I say in the book, these little, gray-blue balls of sweetness and deep flavor. And that's how I always thought about blueberries. I put it in my pancakes on Sunday mornings and so on. But as I studied it more, I actually made contact with an Abenaki herbalist up in Vermont, and she introduced me to a deeper understanding of blueberries and how they have a lot of medicinal uses. The polyphenols in blueberries are great for as an immune booster and antioxidant and so on. And not only that, but if you manage the blueberry bushes as Abenaki folks and other native folks in the Northeast have done for thousands of years, where you prune them down close to the ground this time of year in the fall. In the following year, they'll come back with nice straight stems, and they're a great basket weaving material. And so this information like that just really expanded my knowledge of something that I would put into my pancakes on the weekend.
Absolutely. And I really appreciated that too, that you went into these material culture uses of plants and symbolic uses of plants, and the importance of certain plants culturally beyond just medicine and food, which are the two categories we often see as ethnobotanists showing up. They're very important, but sometimes are maybe overemphasized compared to the other characteristics of plants that we know. I was wondering, so you mentioned your pitch to Timber Press to go more into detail on these plants and give this more intimate view of them. I wonder if you came across certain plant species as you were writing where you had to just stop yourself from writing, where you felt like you could have gone on for the entire book about just that species and had to edit it down to, just a page or two.
Well, just by way of an example, going back to the title of the book, Iwígara has a lot of deep meanings for my people. And when I was working on my PhD, I wrote 350 pages for a dissertation on just that, on that concept of Iwígara. And so, yes, it's easy to go deeper into any of these plants. The one that comes to mind as you were speaking is corn, that we call sunu. And I think that was one of the longer entries in the book. That could easily take up at least half the book, if not more. I know another ethnobotanical friend of mine, Karen Adams, has written 300 pages on just the history of corn in the Western Hemisphere. Again, beans could be another one that could have gone on for a lot longer, and even chili, which is close to my heart. Like I'm a chili fanatic. I grow several species in my and varieties in my garden every year. And I can just go on and on about chili plants and chili and foods with chilies and chili as a medicine and as a preventative and this on and on. Yeah, I had to stop.
I really enjoyed the your mention of the suspicion in the Sierra Madres of people who don't eat chili or don't like eating chili. That you mentioned that those people are viewed as possibly suspect.
Yeah, if someone doesn't like chili, then they're probably a sorcerer. Someone that could cast the evil spell on one of the runners from your community. It's it's seen as among its many uses as a one of those things like a talisman that can ward off those harmful elements from both the physical and spiritual realm. And of course, that includes sorcerers. Then they don't like the smell or taste of chili. And some people in my community will wear these little bags around their waist, and they'll include chili seeds and the skins of chili as sort of a talisman as a protective kind of thing.
I see. Yeah, I think there are a lot of examples that are easy to think of people and cultures, including mine, that take certain foods as really talismanic and central to their way of life. So you mentioned Iwígara, and I know you don't have time here to go through the 300-page dissertation on what that means, but I wonder, because it is the main title of the book, if you could sort of unpack that a little bit and illustrate some of the facets of that concept in Raramuri.
Yeah, I can give you the elevator pitch, where Iwígara is actually a couple of ideas put together. The first part of the word Iwi is by itself, it means cycles and spatial temporal sort of cycles in our way of thinking. It is connected to our beliefs related to death and birth. We feel that, for example, when an individual passes, they transform into iwi, butterflies. And in that phase of being a butterfly, there's a certain species of butterfly, by the way, and we travel around and visit all the important people and places in our lives. And then we leave that realm and fly up into the Milky Way. And you can look up at the night sky on where there's not much light pollution, and you can see the Milky Way. And if you can count all those stars up in there, you can count how many Ramuri people have ever passed from this realm into that one. And then that comes back and begins the other cycle of birth. And then it all starts all over again. That's Iwi. And Gara, to finish the idea, Iwígara is then just the overlapping of those cycles. It's kind of like the verb of Iwi. And so that's what the title is. And the other underlying conception of that is this recognition that all of us, meaning plants, animals, rocks, everything that comprises our natural world, including the sky and underneath, shares the same breath, shares the same cycles. And so that's, in a nutshell, Iwígara.
I was originally trained as a linguist before I came to botany, so I really appreciate your breaking apart the words into its components. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of indigenous language terms like Iwígara, or the maintenance of entire indigenous languages to the maintenance of these ethnobotanical traditions and ethnobotanical science that you're documenting here. I know, some communities have very strong, vibrant languages despite the challenges they've gone through. Others struggle to maintain languages with just a few speakers. Others have to work with archival information because there are no remaining speakers.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a linguist, you might remember from 1955, Clyde Cluckham, who wrote when he was studying the Navajo language that language is culture. Encoded in every language is this vast library of knowledge. And for Indigenous people, then it's this library of a lot of times this knowledge that expresses our relationships, in this case to plants, but to everything around us. And our languages influence our worldviews, the way we think, the way we categorize and classify reality. And we create within each language these linguistic domains to make it easier to share ideas about things. And within these languages, we process metaphors. It's really difficult for humans to speak about anything without using metaphors. And so all these metaphors are culturally specific so often. It took me a long time until maybe I was around 11 years old, because I didn't speak English at first, to understand a simple thing like up the creek without a paddle. For the average American speaker, they totally understand what that means, but someone who doesn't come from that culture doesn't understand, well, why would people be on a creek to begin with? What does paddles have to do with it? So that's the power of language. And so in these languages then related to plant knowledge, it's how we share our knowledge through stories. And the stories are specific to each one of these languages around the world. And so right now, as we're seeing happening on the Navajo reservation, for example, one of the highest death rates as a result of COVID-19, and most of these folks dying on Navajo reservation are the elderly. And I was reading recently this younger Navajo woman saying how every one of those elders that passes away, for every one of those elders that passes away, also passes away this incredible library of cultural knowledge. And unfortunately, a lot of those probably are taking with them a lot of plant knowledge from the Colorado Plateau up there in northern Arizona.
So that's really represents a serious threat to cultural survival and linguistic and knowledge maintenance, as well as just to people and families, when elders hold so much of that knowledge. I wonder, do you see, when you hear something like that, do you see ways that ethnobotanists, either people working just practically with knowledge on the land or academic ethnobotanists can help with that, or can have a positive impact?
Oh yes, ever since the original Bureau of American Ethnology, researchers left out of the East Coast and came out to mostly the West, beginning back in the 1890s, and started documenting all of this, cultural knowledge, including a lot of ethnobotanical knowledge. It's been this crucial library available for, I can speak, as I've seen here and where I'm at in California, a lot of California Native communities have been referring to that kind of information that ethnobotanists have been collecting over the decades as a way to revitalize their cultures, revitalize their connections to place here. On my campus here, we're working directly with the Muwekma Ohlone, who are not only trying to become federally recognized again, but they're also working to reestablish their relationship to this landscape here in the Bay Area. And most of them don't speak their language. None of them really do at this point, but they do have access to those libraries, the ethnobotanical libraries. And also a lot of those researchers collected linguistic information. Mm-hmm. Some of them actually made recordings, and that they have that native people can access today and use to revitalize their languages. So yeah, ethnobotanists play an important role in all of this. And luckily, we're seeing an increase in indigenous ethnobotanists. And so that's even better to have that perspective being added to this incredible library of plant knowledge.
Have you had indigenous students that you've encouraged to go on in ethnobotanical studies from your classes?
Yeah, both here at Cal State East Bay and when I used to teach at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. A quarter of the students there were native students because they got free tuition because it was a land grant campus.
Mm-hmm. So on the topic of students, I was really taken with the way a lot of your plant profiles include these anecdotes of field experiences, either your own field experiences or experiences you had with your students. And I was wondering about how important you find that sort of field work, let's say, especially for teaching, but also for your own research. How do you balance this scholarship, as you mentioned, in these ethnobotanical libraries, the archives that are so important of historical information, and the teaching and writing you do with work outside and with teaching your students outside in contact with plants?
Well, there's no substitute for actually coming in contact with the plants. Kind of reminds me of an old swimming coach that I had when I used to play water polo in high school, and him saying, you lift all the weights you want and everything, but there's no substitute for just swimming. You got to swim. Well, in this case, there's no substitute for actually smelling the plants, feeling their texture, watching the different stages of their growth, and also the specific habitats that they occupy and what other plants and so on, soil types and things are in that same habitat that these plants are growing in. And that was how I learned plant knowledge to begin with. There were no books and so on when I was growing up. I was always just actually being there and helping my mother and my grandmother collect the plants. And at that, in that process, I learned, how to approach the plants as well. Because they are, in our way of thinking, they are living beings. And so in my field schools, I would impart that to my students as well. You have to approach them with reverence and respect. You don't just go up to a plant and yank it out of the ground. Some people do that. And like I say, so there's no substitute for actually just smelling a plant. You can read about the smell of a plant, like, for example, poison hemlock. You can read about what poison hemlock roots smells like and so on. I remember Michael Moore describing it in one of his books as smelling like a dead mouse. But nothing can substitute for actually digging up the root of water hemlock and smelling it and going, oh my God. And then you really have that direct experience that Richard I. Ford describes in the definition for ethnobotany.
Direct experience. Yeah. I have a bad habit. My wife hates this, that I'll taste plants that I walk past, or crush them and smell them, or feel the texture or something. And usually I'm fairly sure I know what it is I'm tasting, but so I really felt for one of your students that you described in the profile of tobacco, who had a terrible experience having presumably innocently tasted a Nicotiana glauca leaf in an attempt to gain this direct experience. And I wonder if you can give a little more detail about that specific experience, and if that speaks to something broader about plants that heal and plants that are poisonous.
Well, I used to teach these field schools, these ethnobotany field schools. And in part of the field school, we'd jump in these 15-passenger vans and drive around the Southwest. And at one point, we were outside of Phoenix in one of the tributaries into the Salt River drainage area. And I would do what I call drive-by ethnobotany. We'd drive by and I'd look, said, there's that tree, there's that species. But in this one case, there was this tree tobacco that I had been talking about. And you don't see it too often. So I actually stopped the van. We got out and I talked about the tree tobacco growing out of this cliff. And I reminded my students that, one of the leaves of that species of tobacco has the same amount of nicotine as a whole pack of Marlboro. And you have to really be careful with it. It's a very dangerous plant, but if you use it correctly, if you know what you're doing, it can be very beneficial as well. Unbeknownst to me, one of the students had grabbed a couple of the leaves, and she was in the second van. We had 2 vans for that trip. And maybe an hour past that point, we had these walkie-talkies in both vans, and I hear this squelching voice, Dr. Salmón, stop, stop, stop. Wendy's sick. And we stopped the vans, and she got out. Her lips were black. Her face was all red. She was sweating. And she got out and immediately vomited everything because she had taken one of the leaves and was chewing on it, thinking that she could, treat it like chewing tobacco and get a little rush. Luckily, I had some first aid training, and we got her back around, and she was okay. But if she had taken any more, I'm not sure what we would have done. We probably had to get to the nearest emergency room because that could be very dangerous. And so, it reminds me of, when people have to actually be careful with plants. They are chock full of phytochemicals. And sometimes these constituents, these plant chemicals, can be very dangerous. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can harm yourself. And so, that's where, again, the opportunity to remind people, don't just go out and start picking plants and making teas out of them and so on. And people will try that. It seems like every couple of years there's someone who makes a tea of datura, for example, and nearly or actually kills themselves, thinking they're going to go on a trip, but a trip they might not come back from.
Yeah, I think that's just such a you can say that the general concept, but the story itself is so powerful. That really infuses, to hear the specific story of your student really infuses that general lesson into my psyche, at least. And so the book is just filled with these stories, both from your own experience, but also older stories, traditional stories. And I wonder, this is something I think about because I'm married to a novelist, someone who thinks about stories very deeply, whereas I'm really an ecological scientist. I think about knowledge as data points. And I wonder what you thought about sort of the importance of story in transmitting knowledge and maintaining knowledge systems. And of course, if there's a specific traditional story that you came across or already knew but relayed in the book that you were willing to share, I'm sure we'd love to hear it too.
Well, story is how indigenous people around the world reproduce knowledge and transfer knowledge. Story is powerful in that it's a medium where the storyteller and the listener can find commonality. Story brings communities and sometimes entire nations together because we're all living in and sharing a single story, which reaffirms our identities. And in my case, it can reaffirm identity as Ramuri. On a larger scale, there's stories that can reaffirm people, what it means to be an American and so on. And so that's the power of story. So that's why I use stories often in the plant entries in the book as an opportunity for the reader to maybe find a little piece of their own self in, say, horsetail, where, equisetum, where trickster, coyote, in this case, trickster can take on many forms, but a lot of times among American Indians, it's coyote. And, coyote is traveling along this river. And I'm going to make the story short, but he was doing one of his coyote things where he was trying to cause some trouble. And in the process of being mischievous, he falls into this fast-flowing river. And he's half drowning and trying to stay afloat and so on. And he sees ahead, some horsetail growing along the bank of this river. And so he tries to maneuver himself over there, and he grabs onto the horsetail, and it stops him from flowing down this fast-moving river and from drowning probably. But he's still in the river, and he's losing his grip, and then he finally talked to the horsetail, and he says, you're an ugly plant, but if you help me out of this river, I'll help you become a beautiful plant. And the horsetail thinks, yeah, I'm not sure. You're a troublemaker. Should I help you out? But then coyote's like, okay, please, please, please. I'll keep my promise, And so finally, horsetail helps coyote pull himself out of the river. And coyote keeps his promise. And if you look at horsetail today, it's this incredible, tall, verdant green plant with these, later stages, it has these willowy sort of leaves coming out of it, and these pine cone-like seed heads on top. And then if you look even closer at each one of the whorls, there's this really incredible purplish sort of color there. And it is an amazing plant. The good thing about that story, besides it being just a fun story and a way for you to make fun of coyotes some more for being a troublemaker, is that you also learn some of the ecology of horsetail, the equisetum. We learn, for example, that it likes to grow near water. And we learn from the story, how to identify horsetail as well. And so story is more than just fun. Indigenous stories like this are educational. They can be ecological as well.
Yeah, it's really a knowledge package that conveys so much. And so thank you so much for sharing that with us and sharing all these stories throughout the book, and also for sharing your time here this evening. I think we've pretty much, I could keep chatting with you all night long, but I think we've hit the cutoff for taking some questions from the audience, which I think will be really wonderful as well. And Shane showed back up. Shane?
Hi. Yeah, I'm back for the audience Q&A. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I have been able to look a little bit through the book, and I especially I love that you talked about the blueberries, because I think that is one of my favorite fruits, and I loved reading about that one in there. My question, to kind of encourage more questions from the audience, there are several mentions of Missouri-specific kind of plants in this book, and I was wondering if you knew of, or if you could share maybe some of the, like a story about one of the Missouri kind of native plants that someone around here might be very familiar with.
I can't really think of anything more specific to Missouri, I know echinacea is a very important plant that'll grow up over there in the plains areas of Missouri. But I can't think of a story connected to echinacea. Sorry.
There's the gooseberry. That was one that you had mentioned in the book a little bit, which is, I mean, gooseberries are something that I grew up with. Also the yucca. I actually raised a yucca plant when I was a wee child and still miss it. It actually was transported when my parents moved. So it still is alive and floral and beautiful to this day. So
You actually grew and kept alive a yucca plant?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah, yucca is an incredible plant. It's one of those toolboxes of plants where we start at the root. The root itself, full of saponins, can be used in ceremony for Native peoples for ritual hair washing. And I've done it myself. And because of this, there's this microscopic size sort of silica in the root of yucca. And when you wash your hair with it, the saponins create this suds, but then the silica literally makes these microscopic little cuts in your scalp. And so, it's a way to get rid of the grease in your hair, but then it also, revigorates or invigorates your scalp as well. Then if we move up the plant, you can, there's the leaves, those bayonet-looking sort of leaves that grow out of the base of the plant can be used for weaving things, for weaving sandals, for weaving hats. If it's a hot day, you can actually take off the stem. If you're careful, you can actually have a needle and thread built in, from the tip of the leaf and so on. If you pick it at the right time of year, the flowers are edible when they're still sort of greenish white. And then later on, make a really important medicine for kidney problems and so on. And so it just goes on and on. I've actually used for several years before it finally disintegrated or broke on me the central stem of a yucca plant for a walking stick because it's lightweight but strong. So it just goes on and on, the important uses of yucca.
All right, so we do have quite a few questions from the audience now, so great. I'm gonna keep those coming. Jan and I got to hear about this, and so did Robbie earlier. So Jan is actually asking about the stringed instruments behind you and asking what plants are providing these.
Yeah, I'm a luthier. I make my instruments, and man, if I were to, let's see, what plants are represented behind me? The top of that cello is Sitka spruce from up in the Pacific Northwest. The back and sides of that cello are big leaf maple, also from the Puget Sound area. That guitar is a classical guitar that was actually Spanish cedar for the top, and then rosewood for the sides and back. And then there's an instrument right over my right shoulder, and then that's Western red cedar. There's some ebony in there. There's probably 5 or 6 other plants represented from those instruments that are just behind me. Yeah, I think there's an instrument over my shoulder. You can't see well. There's also some myrtle wood from up in the coast of Oregon. Yeah, what's the other name for myrtle wood? Is another word for it right now. I can't remember right now. Madrone. Yeah, it's a kind of madrone. Yeah. So yeah, I like working with wood, and I get to talk about a direct relationship with plants. You don't get much more direct than building an instrument from plants.
Katie is asking, so you mentioned growing a few chili varieties in your personal garden. Do you have a couple of plants in your garden with which you have a clear kinship? And I will add that Michael agrees with if someone doesn't like chilies, they are suspect. I agree as well.
Well, I try to keep growing as much as possible. And here in the Bay Area, you can almost do it year-round cilantro. because I use it in a lot of my cooking. Of course, the chili plants. There's another plant. It's a variety of quinopod, and it's known in Spanish as epazote. And I use that in a lot of cooking as well. Epazote has this really, not only does it just add good flavor to whatever you're cooking, it has these phytochemical qualities where it actually reduces gas, stomach gas. And so when I make a pot of beans, for example, I'll put a couple of leaves of epazote in the pot of beans so that when I eat it, kind of decreases the after effects of eating pinto beans and so on. It's also a really good medicine for colds and flu and things like that. And so those plants specifically, I always try to keep around because they mean a lot to me. They're connected directly to my identity. Whenever I eat epazote, for example, I immediately think of my grandmother on my mother's side and my family, and there's all these cultural and familial memories pop right back into my mind when I eat plants like that.
I love that. I also have my family has a lot of farmers, so I have those same kind of kinship with heirloom tomatoes and several varieties and corn and things like that. So there's just being in a garden and makes me have these very flooded with wonderful memories.
Exactly. Yeah, I think my wife gets a little tired of my stories because I do a lot of the cooking in our house, and oftentimes I'll tell a story when I'm cooking. Like I'm making, just the other day I made enchiladas, and I had to talk about my family's and enchiladas and the different kinds of enchiladas we make and how we made them and so on. That's the power of food in this case.
Jeffrey asks, is it correct that there are something like 150 native North American languages in use today? To what extent is the concept of Iwígara and even the word shared across these languages and cultures?
Well, the word isn't shared across the languages. That's very specific to my tribe's language. My tribe's language is a Uto-Aztecan linguistic family language. It's the largest indigenous linguistic family of languages in the Western Hemisphere, meaning that my language is related to like the Hopi language, the Ute, the Shoshone, Yaqui, and a bunch of other indigenous languages. And I'm not sure about the number of 150. They might be right, but when Europeans first showed up here in 1492, there were across the Western Hemisphere at least 2,000 different languages, not including the different dialectical offshoots. So, if we counted all the dialects from, say, my language is Raamuri, but there's actually 7-8 different dialects. If we count all those dialects, so that 2,000 can become, 50,000 different languages at least, maybe even more. No one really knows for sure. And for each one of those languages was a specific set of ecological, cultural knowledge unique to a specific landscape across the Western Hemisphere. We can spread that out around the world. Each one of these indigenous languages is a voice of that specific landscape, whether it's North America, South America, the African continent, or whatever.
James's question is, how do you see ethnobotany serving as a medium for deconstructing colonialism and racism?
That's a great question. And, I teach here at Cal State East Bay. It's American Indian Studies, but it's housed in the Ethnic Studies department. And decolonialism is a big part of what our department does in our coursework. And one reason why they hired me, years ago, was partly to bring that perspective, to use plant knowledge in this case, because our campus is incredibly diverse. It's the most diverse campus in North America in terms of the different languages and cultures represented by the student body on our campus. And plant knowledge can be used as an avenue for helping students interested in decolonizing their minds, their lifestyles, their diets, through helping them to revitalize their connection to their specific culture's heritage of plant knowledge, and a lot of times food knowledge, because decolonizing is a way, it's, in simplest terms, it's a political act, a rejection of the colonizing influences that Western Europe has had on indigenous communities here in the Western Hemisphere. And a growing number of students are wanting to find different ways to move within our society, but still hanging on to their long-term cultural memory, but connecting it to short-term modern technology and so on. And ethnobotany can act as a way to, to kind of bridge that, that chasm.
Ashley is asking, do you have any favorite plant traditions or crafts for the winter season, since we are almost to the first days of winter?
Well, right now, outside of my window here, I'm growing fava beans. Because I try to grow fava beans, this time of year, because they do overwinter, and it puts nitrogen back into the soil where I'll plant my plants and veggies and tomatoes and chilies next year. I grow a lot of greens like chard and so on, and different kinds of of other greens, because they do overwinter here in the Bay Area. And as far as could you repeat the question again? It was about foods as well.
Well, favorite plant traditions or crafts for the winter season.
Oh, crafts. Yeah, I don't know about crafts. Besides, I just keep finding excuses to build another instrument.
Someone did ask, have you ever built, Brittany asked, have you made a violin?
My wife's a violinist, and so I've made her all but one of her violins, I think. She had several violins that are hanging on in another room in our house here.
It's impressive. I am impressed. Mariel's question is, can you speak about how climate change is affecting indigenous communities and their relationship to plants?
It has been rough on indigenous communities. The communities that are first having direct negative experiences with climate change are Native communities around the world, up in the Arctic Circle. Entire Inupiat and other indigenous communities in the coast of Alaska have had literally move their communities to higher ground because of rising seas. In the South Pacific, there's a couple of Native Islander communities that have had to leave their islands because their islands are being inundated with the rising Pacific Ocean. Closer to home here, I'll never forget a Takomish elder, a woman, talking about, this was a few years ago, talking about how she used to walk through on the trails to the woods up in the Cascades, and the ground would feel almost like a sponge. It was so rich with nutrients and moisture and so on as she was going along collecting plants. And now she said it's like walking on a sidewalk. And there's fewer plants to collect. The plants are either disappearing or they're finding ways to move. In California here, we're seeing entire stands of redwoods and sequoia, Joshua tree disappearing because of increasingly destructive fires. Indigenous communities are, starting a couple hundred years ago, were not permitted to do their prescribed burns as they used to do here in California, which maintained the plant diversity and animal diversity, but also provided for, in one case here in California especially, larger harvest of acorns, which is a staple food for Native Californians, because the prescribed fires would decrease competition among the oak trees and also useful herbaceous plants. That's not able to happen anymore. And I can just go on and on with examples. For example, in the Colorado Plateau, northern Arizona, Hopi farmers are having a harder and harder time growing their corn and beans and squashes and so on, because the rains aren't coming when they're supposed to. When they do come, they come at the wrong time. And it wipes out their crop, for example. And so, so Native peoples are definitely are experiencing it firsthand, because they're the ones still living, in a lot of cases, a subsistence lifestyle on the landscape. Most of us in our modern society are indirectly affected by climate change, because we're not living that subsistence sort of lifestyle.
Let's do one more question, and then one and a half-ish questions. Colette's question, Colette is a friend of mine. My Mexican part Yaqui grandmother always had a resurrection plant, Rose of Jericho, in the house for good luck. Is there an indigenous connection? Do you know?
I know what that plant is, but I've never come across it, actually. And I really not that familiar with that plant in terms of its uses and so on. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer that question. I know a lot of plants, but not all of them.
All right, then we will end with Angelica's question. Angelica, I love to grow and plant succulents. I know that cacti, Nepales are edible. Are there any other types of succulents that are healing or edible? And I will say that those answers are in the book.
I have a xeriscape front yard and includes a lot of succulents. And yes, a lot of succulents are edible. For example, in the book, you mentioned the prickly pear, the reddish fruits. Choya buds you can eat. They kind of taste, how does a choya bud taste? It kind of has an oatmeal sort of flavor. Sawattles, you can eat the fruits of sawato as well. And I can just go on and on. There's different kinds of species of cacti that are not only edible, but have a lot of medicinal value as well. In prickly pear especially, you can eat the young pads, and they're really good for mucinogens, help to slow down digestion, and just very nutritious as well. That's why they're good for people who are trying to recover from adult onset type 2 diabetes. We've seen a growing number of Native peoples resorting to their traditional diets to help control their diabetes, and prickly pear pads are connected to that.
I've used prickly pear syrup in several different drinks that I have concocted before. It's really a beautiful ingredient.
I was so surprised to find, I think of those as a typical desert plant, like other succulents, and I was so surprised to see prickly pears growing native in Missouri. That was one of the most shocking things for me when I came here.
The Lewis and Clark expedition, as they were moving across the northern plains, they complained about the smaller species of prickly pear they had spines that were so thick and stout they were punching through their moccasins that a lot of the core discovery wore. Yeah, so they're everywhere, all the way up into Montana, even parts of Canada.
Well, I want to thank you both for this beautiful, incredible conversation about this beautiful and incredible book. The book is available for sale at left-bank.com. It is really just an incredible resource, an incredible read. And I want to thank you, Enrique, for writing this, for having it available for all of us. And it is available for sale at left-bank.com. I want to thank you, Robbie, from the Missouri Botanical Garden for making this event part of your series and for making it happen.
It was my
Thank
pleasure.
you so much.
Great to meet you, Shane and Robbie. It was great.
Really a pleasure. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Shane.
And for the audience, I will see you next year. I'm going to have a couple of weeks where you will not see my face on Facebook Live for a while. So thank you all so much for joining us, and have a fantastic evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.